Nero became Roman emperor in AD 54 at just 16 years old. While later generations remembered him primarily as a tyrant, many ancient sources also describe a ruler consumed by pleasure, intoxication, and excess. As emperor, Nero had access to the rarest substances in the Roman world. Opium, mandrake, henbane, powerful wines, and exotic herbal preparations flowed through the imperial court, where medicine and recreation often overlapped. Roman historians such as Suetonius and Cassius describe banquets that lasted for days. Guests drank continuously while musicians performed, perfumes filled the air, and physicians remained nearby to help participants continue indulging. Nero became increasingly obsessed with entertainment, luxury, and personal pleasure. His court developed a reputation for near-constant intoxication, with enormous sums spent on feasts, spectacles, and sensory excess. As the years passed, Nero's behavior became more erratic. He neglected administration in favor of performances, public appearances, and extravagant celebrations. By AD 68, revolts had erupted across the Roman world. The Praetorian Guard abandoned him, and the Senate declared him a public enemy. Nero fled Rome and hid in a villa outside the city. As soldiers closed in, he struggled to take his own life before finally dying by suicide on June 9, AD 68, at the age of 30. Frederick William I became King of Prussia in 1713 and transformed his kingdom into one of the most disciplined military states in Europe. Behind that image, however, was a ruler whose health and behavior were increasingly shaped by heavy alcohol consumption and constant self-medication. Contemporary accounts describe Frederick William consuming large quantities of strong beer and spirits throughout his adult life. Drinking was a central part of his daily routine, particularly during the famous Tobacco College gatherings, where military officers and advisors spent long evenings drinking, smoking, and discussing affairs of state. As his health deteriorated, physicians prescribed a variety of medicinal treatments, herbal compounds, and drug-based remedies common in 18th century Europe. Rather than reducing his consumption, the king increasingly relied on both alcohol and medication to manage chronic pain, illness, and stress. Over time, the effects became difficult to ignore. Frederick William suffered from obesity, severe gout, edema, and other debilitating conditions. His temper grew more unpredictable, and his violent outbursts became infamous throughout the royal court. Even his son, the future Frederick the Great, endured years of abuse from a father. By the late 1730s, the king's body was failing. Years of heavy drinking, poor health, and chronic medical treatments had taken their toll. He died on May 31, 1740, at the age of 51. Marcus Aurelius became Roman emperor in AD 161 and ruled the Roman Empire during one of the most difficult periods in its history. While remembered today as a Stoic philosopher and the author of Meditations, he also lived in an age when opium was one of the most widely used medicines in the Roman world. Throughout his reign, Marcus suffered from recurring health problems, including chronic pain, digestive disorders, insomnia, and periods of physical exhaustion brought on by constant military campaigns. His personal physician was Galen, one of the most famous doctors of antiquity. Galen regularly prescribed complex medical preparations containing opium, a standard treatment for pain relief, insomnia, and stomach ailments. Ancient medical texts indicate that Marcus consumed these remedies for extended periods while governing the empire and leading armies along the Danube frontier. Unlike many rulers who used drugs recreationally, Marcus relied on opium primarily as medicine. Nevertheless, the repeated use of opium-based treatments over many years has led some historians to speculate that he may have developed a degree of dependence. Despite persistent illness, Marcus spent much of his reign fighting Germanic tribes, managing the Antonine Plague, and overseeing one of the largest empires in the world. In AD 180, while campaigning near modern-day Vienna, Marcus Aurelius became seriously ill and died at the age of 58. Christian VII became King of Denmark and Norway in 1766 at the age of 17. From an early age, he displayed signs of severe mental instability, but his condition was worsened by a lifestyle dominated by excess, vice, and heavy consumption of alcohol and pharmaceutical drugs. During the 18th century, opium-based medicines were among the most common treatments in Europe, and Christian was frequently exposed to them through court physicians attempting to manage his deteriorating mental health. As king, Christian spent much of his time indulging in drinking, visiting brothels, and surrounding himself with companions who encouraged his destructive habits. By the 1770s, Christian's ability to govern had largely collapsed. Government affairs were increasingly handled by advisors, ministers, and eventually the royal physician Johann Friedrich Struensee. While Struensee introduced major reforms, Christian spent much of his time isolated from state affairs and under the influence of alcohol, medicine. As the years passed, he experienced hallucinations, uncontrollable outbursts, and long periods of instability. Although he technically remained king, real power gradually passed into the hands of regents and government officials. Christian VII died on March 13, 1808, at the age of 59 after decades of illness, substance use, and mental deterioration. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933 and transformed the country into a totalitarian state that would eventually plunge Europe into the Second World War. While remembered primarily for his political ideology and military aggression, Hitler was also one of the most heavily medicated leaders of the 20th century. Throughout his later years, he relied on a vast array of drugs, stimulants, sedatives, and hormone treatments administered by his personal physician, Theodor Morell. Beginning in the mid-1930s, Morell prescribed Hitler an increasing number of medications to combat fatigue, digestive problems, insomnia, chronic pain, and declining health. Medical records recovered after the war show that Hitler received hundreds of injections and consumed dozens of different substances. By the early 1940s, his daily routine often revolved around scheduled doses designed to maintain his energy and concentration. As the war progressed, Hitler's dependence on medication increased dramatically. Witnesses described periods of hyperactivity, followed by exhaustion, trembling, mood swings, and worsening physical deterioration. By 1944, he displayed visible symptoms including shaking hands, poor balance, and chronic digestive distress. Morell responded by prescribing even stronger drugs and more frequent injections. During the final months of the war, Hitler remained inside the Führer bunker beneath Berlin, while Soviet forces closed in on the city. His health deteriorated rapidly as the Third Reich disintegrated around him. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in the bunker at the age of 56. Tsar Nicholas II became Emperor of Russia in 1894 and ruled the largest empire in the world during its final years. Unlike many rulers associated with substance abuse, there is little evidence that Nicholas himself was a heavy user of alcohol or narcotics. However, during the final decade of his reign, he increasingly relied on physicians, sedatives, and medical treatments to cope with the enormous pressures facing the Russian monarchy. The emperor lived under constant strain. Revolutionary movements, labor unrest, military defeats, and political crises placed unprecedented demands on the imperial government. Nicholas frequently suffered from exhaustion, anxiety, and insomnia. The greater medical concern within the royal family centered on his son, Tsarevich Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. The constant fear surrounding Alexei's condition consumed much of Nicholas's attention and contributed to the family's growing dependence on physicians, healers, and medical treatments. The search for relief eventually brought the mystic Grigory Rasputin into the imperial court, further damaging the monarchy's reputation. As Russia entered the First World War in 1914, the pressure on Nicholas intensified dramatically. Military disasters, economic collapse, and political instability placed the emperor under relentless stress. By 1917, the Russian Empire was nearing collapse. Nicholas abdicated the throne in March 1917 after more than 2 decades of rule. Following his abdication, he and his family were held under house arrest by the new revolutionary government. On the night of July 17, 1918, Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, and several loyal servants were executed in Yekaterinburg. Jahangir became the 4th Mughal emperor in 1605 and ruled one of the wealthiest empires in the world. Unlike many rulers whose addictions were hidden by court officials, Jahangir openly recorded his substance use in his own memoirs. From a young age, he developed a habit of heavy drinking that gradually escalated into one of the most documented cases of substance abuse among major monarchs in history. According to his own writings, Jahangir began drinking alcohol as a teenager and steadily increased his consumption over the years. At the height of his addiction, he reportedly consumed around 20 cups of strong liquor a day. The constant drinking severely damaged his health, forcing imperial physicians to intervene. Unable to reduce his dependence entirely, Jahangir began substituting part of his alcohol intake with opium, creating a long-term reliance on both substances. As the years passed, his addiction became widely known throughout the Mughal court. Foreign visitors, diplomats, and merchants frequently commented on the emperor's drinking habits. Although Jahangir remained capable of ruling, periods of heavy intoxication increasingly affected his daily routine. Important responsibilities were often delegated to trusted advisors, most notably his powerful wife, Nur Jahan, who gradually became one of the most influential figures in the empire. By the 1620s, decades of alcohol and opium use had significantly weakened Jahangir's health. He suffered from breathing problems, physical weakness, and recurring illnesses while continuing to rely on intoxicants. Court physicians repeatedly attempted to control his consumption, but years of dependence had already taken a heavy toll on his body. In 1627, while returning from Kashmir, Jahangir's condition deteriorated rapidly. He died on October 28, 1627, at the age of 58. Historians continue to debate the exact medical cause of death, but few dispute that prolonged alcohol and opium abuse contributed to his decline. Napoleon III became Emperor of the French in 1852 and ruled France during a period of rapid industrialization, economic growth, and imperial expansion. Behind the image of a modernizing ruler, however, Napoleon spent much of his adult life suffering from severe health problems that required constant medical treatment. The most serious was a painful bladder condition caused by kidney and bladder stones, an illness that progressively worsened throughout his reign. To manage the intense pain, Napoleon relied heavily on opium-based medicines and other narcotic treatments commonly prescribed in 19th century Europe. By the 1860s, Napoleon frequently experienced severe pain, fatigue, and difficulty concentrating. Despite these problems, he continued directing French domestic and foreign policy while relying on increasingly powerful medical treatments to remain functional. His health reached a critical stage during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Napoleon was already suffering from advanced bladder disease and required constant medical attention while leading French forces. After France's defeat at the Battle of Sedan, he was captured by the Prussians and forced into exile in Britain. Away from power, his condition continued to deteriorate despite ongoing treatment with narcotic pain medications. In January 1873, surgeons attempted an operation to remove the stones that had plagued him for years. The procedure failed to restore his health. Napoleon III died on January 9, 1873, at the age of 64 after decades of chronic illness and near-continuous dependence on pain-relieving drugs. Queen Victoria became Queen of the United Kingdom in 1837 and ruled for more than 63 years, longer than any British monarch before her. While she is remembered as the symbol of the Victorian era, she also lived during a period when powerful drugs were widely used in medicine and were available without many of the restrictions that exist today. Throughout her life, Victoria regularly used pharmaceutical preparations that contained opiates and other narcotic substances prescribed by royal physicians. One of the most common medicines of the 19th century was laudanum, a tincture made from opium that was widely used to treat pain, anxiety, insomnia, digestive problems, and a variety of other ailments. Victoria belonged to a generation of European royalty that relied heavily on such medications. Historical records also indicate that she used cocaine-containing preparations, which were considered legitimate medical treatments during the late 19th century and were often prescribed to combat fatigue, depression, and physical discomfort. As she grew older, Victoria increasingly relied on physicians to manage chronic pain, rheumatism, and the physical effects of aging. Despite her advancing age and growing dependence on medication, Victoria continued to perform many of her royal duties. She remained on the throne through major political crises, imperial expansion, and enormous social change across the British Empire. By the end of her reign, she had become one of the most recognizable figures in the world. Victoria's health declined during her final years as she continued receiving medical treatment for chronic illnesses and pain. She died at Osborne House on January 22, 1901, at the age of 81. George IV became Prince Regent of Britain in 1811 and King of the United Kingdom in 1820. He had developed a reputation for excessive drinking, lavish spending, and chronic overindulgence that made him one of the most controversial monarchs in British history. Throughout his adult life, George consumed enormous quantities of wine, brandy, and port. He also relied heavily on laudanum, a popular medicine made from opium that was widely prescribed for pain, anxiety, insomnia, and digestive problems. What began as occasional medical use gradually became a regular habit. Physicians frequently treated him for ailments linked to his lifestyle, but the king showed little interest in moderation. As the years passed, the effects became increasingly visible. George gained massive amounts of weight, suffered from chronic digestive disorders, breathing difficulties, gout, and recurring illnesses. By the 1820s, George's health had deteriorated dramatically. Walking became difficult, and he often required assistance to move around royal residences. George IV died at Windsor Castle on June 26, 1830, at the age of 67.